Summer came to Meridian, Mississippi in 1956 like a fever, the kind that makes you see things that aren't there. 14-year-old Thomas Wade Brennan disappeared on June 23rd, vanishing between his paper route and Sunday supper, leaving only his bicycle lying sideways in the dirt beside County Road 19. The case went cold as quickly as the town's collective memory allowed, buried beneath cotton harvests and church socials, and the desperate need to believe that evil doesn't live where you know everyone's name. 68 years later, a span longer than most lives, a genealogist working on an unrelated family tree stumbled across something impossible in Thomas's case file. DNA technology, science fiction in 1956, rose from the grave like prophecy. The truth emerged slowly, the way morning fog lifts to reveal a landscape you thought you knew. What the evidence revealed would force an entire county to confront the man they'd honored for decades, the one who'd stood at every town meeting speaking of safety and virtue while carrying his secret like poison. This is a story about how monsters wear the masks we want to see, about how a community can look straight at darkness and choose to call it light. The killer lived among them for 70 years, and perhaps that's what makes sleep impossible now. If this type of deep-dive cold case investigation speaks to you, consider subscribing to support more stories that refuse to let the forgotten stay buried. The detective who finally broke the case was named Claire Hollis, and she'd been carrying Thomas Wade Brennan's file in her mind for 3 years, ever since the Meridian Police Department digitized their archives, and she'd spent a sleepless January night reading through cases that predated her own birth. She was 37, divorced, childless by choice and circumstance both, the kind of woman who ate dinner standing at her kitchen counter while reading autopsy reports. Her apartment in downtown Meridian overlooked a parking lot, and she'd stood at that window too many nights, watching shadows move between cars and thinking about all the ways a person can disappear. It was October 2024 when she pulled Thomas's file again, late on a Thursday, when the department was mostly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the coffee maker muttering to itself in the break room. The case had that particular quality of old tragedy: yellowed pages, typewritten reports with letters that punched through the paper like small wounds. Someone had stored the physical evidence properly, sealed in bags that had survived decades in the basement archives, protected from flood and fire and the general entropy that claims most things. The bicycle was still there. Thomas's bicycle, a red Schwinn that his father had bought him for Christmas 1955, still bore traces of mud from that June day. The paper bag he'd used for his route. A single shoe, the left one, found 3 days later in a drainage ditch 2 miles from where the bicycle lay. These objects had the weight of relics, things touched by the last moments before everything changed. Claire spread the evidence photos across her desk as rain began against the window, that October sound of summer dying. Thomas smiled from his school photo, taken 4 months before he disappeared. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's serious eyes, and whoever had taken the photo had captured something in his expression. Not quite defiance, not quite fear. The look of a boy standing on the edge of something, though no one could have known it then. The case file told a story the town had decided to forget. Thomas Wade Brennan, 14 years old, son of Robert and Eleanor Brennan, paper boy, altar boy at First Methodist, played clarinet in the school band, had a younger sister named Caroline, who was 7 when her brother vanished and would grow up to become a librarian in Jackson, carrying her grief like a stone in her pocket, never quite able to set it down. On June 23, 1956, Thomas left his house at 5:47 a.m. for his paper route. 19 customers, a route he could complete in 45 minutes. He was expected home by 7 a.m. for breakfast before church. He never arrived. His father found the bicycle at 8:23 a.m., lying on its side beside County Road 19, newspapers scattered in the dirt like abandoned prayers. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no body. The investigation in 1956 had been handled by Sheriff Warren Caldwell, a man Claire had researched extensively. He'd served as sheriff for 32 years, retiring in 1973 with a parade and a plaque, and the town's eternal gratitude. The case file bore his neat handwriting, each report precisely dated and signed. He'd interviewed 73 people. He'd organized search parties that combed through pine forests and dragged ponds. He'd brought in bloodhounds from Jackson. Everything by the book, everyone agreed. A tragedy, certainly. But no one could say Warren Caldwell hadn't done everything possible. Claire had learned early in her career that the most important skill in detective work was knowing what questions to ask about the questions that weren't asked. She'd read through Caldwell's reports a dozen times, and each time she felt the same unease. Not what was there, but what was missing. The investigation had been thorough in every direction except one. Every direction except the one that would have led to Warren Caldwell's own door. The breakthrough came from genealogy, from the strange miracle of strangers building family trees on the internet. A woman named Patricia Monroe in Oregon had been researching her mother's side, entering names into databases, trying to understand where she came from. Her grandmother had been from Meridian, Mississippi, had married young and moved west, and never spoke much about her childhood. Patricia was trying to fill in the gaps, the way people do when they sense there's a story no one wanted to tell. She'd submitted her DNA to one of those ancestry websites, the kind that promises to reveal your heritage. What it revealed instead was a familial match to DNA found under Thomas Wade Brennan's fingernails in 1956, preserved all these years in an evidence bag in a basement in Mississippi. The DNA that had meant nothing in 1956 suddenly meant everything in 2024. Claire got the call on a Tuesday afternoon. A genealogist from the state crime lab, voice tight with something between excitement and horror, explaining about genetic genealogy, about building family trees backward from DNA. The DNA under Thomas's fingernails belonged to someone related to Patricia Monroe's grandmother, someone who had been in Meridian in 1956, someone whose family tree Claire could construct, branch by branch, following blood back to its source. It took 6 weeks of obsessive work, 6 weeks of census records and birth certificates and marriage licenses, 6 weeks of building a family tree that led, inevitably, to one name: Warren Caldwell. Sheriff Warren Caldwell, who had investigated Thomas's disappearance so thoroughly, who had interviewed everyone, searched everywhere, done everything right, except for the small matter of his own guilt. Claire sat in her apartment the night she confirmed it, rain against the windows, the city lights reflected in puddles below. She'd spread the evidence across her dining room table, the family tree on one side, the old case file on the other. Somewhere between them was the truth that had waited 68 years to emerge. Warren Caldwell had died in 1998 at age 89, leaving behind a reputation so pristine it gleamed. 32 years as sheriff, serving his community with distinction. Husband to Martha Caldwell for 60 years. Father of 2, grandfather of 5. Deacon at First Methodist Church, the same church where Thomas had been an altar boy. Caldwell had given the eulogy at Thomas's memorial service in 1957, when the family finally accepted that their boy wasn't coming home. He'd spoken of loss and faith and the mystery of God's plan. The DNA didn't lie. The family tree didn't lie. But the hardest part was still ahead, proving what had happened, reconstructing a crime from 1956 when everyone who remembered that June day was dead or dying. Claire requested the exhumation on a Friday morning, standing in front of a judge and laying out the genealogical evidence, the family connection, the impossibility of coincidence. The judge was 73, old enough to remember Warren Caldwell, old enough to feel the weight of what Claire was asking. He signed the order anyway, because the law doesn't care about reputation, only truth. Thomas Wade Brennan woke at 5:30 a.m. on June 23, 1956, the way he woke every morning during summer break, to his father's alarm clock ringing through the wall, to his mother's footsteps in the kitchen below. Their house on Maple Street was small and white with green shutters, the kind of house that looked like every other house on the block, which was exactly how his mother wanted it. Being ordinary was safe. Being noticed was dangerous. This was the South in 1956, and safety meant keeping your head down, your lawn mowed, your opinions to yourself. Thomas dressed in the dark, jeans, white t-shirt, canvas sneakers that were starting to split at the toe. His room was small, walls covered with pictures cut from Life magazine. Baseball players mostly. Mickey Mantle mid-swing. Willie Mays making an impossible catch. Thomas didn't really care about baseball, but his father did. And having Willie Mays on your wall in Mississippi in 1956 required the kind of courage that looked like casual indifference. His father had put the picture up himself, had said nothing about it, and that nothing had meant everything. He grabbed his paper bag from the closet. Canvas, worn soft from daily use, his initials inked in his mother's careful hand. TWB, Thomas Wade Brennan. He liked seeing his full name like that, official and permanent. At school they called him Tommy, which he hated. At church they called him Thomas, which he tolerated. At home, his mother called him Wade, her father's name, a small act of remembrance for a man Thomas had never met. The morning was already hot when he stepped outside, that thick Mississippi heat that made breathing feel like work. Summer in Meridian meant sweating through your clothes by 7 a.m., meant cicadas screaming in the trees, meant the sun turning everything white and hazy by noon. The newspaper bundle waited on the corner where the delivery truck left it every morning at 5 a.m. sharp. Thomas loaded his bag methodically, 19 papers, routes he could do blindfolded by now. He'd been a paperboy for 8 months, saving money for something he hadn't told anyone about yet. A clarinet of his own, a good one, not the battered school instrument he played in band. He had $37 saved, hidden in a coffee can under his bed. He needed $65 more. The bike route took him through the white neighborhood first. Big houses with wide porches, dogs that barked from behind fences, sprinklers already running to keep the lawns green. Then across the railroad tracks to the colored section, smaller houses packed closer together, different porches, different dogs, same humanity underneath all the artificial divisions that humans create to make sense of the senseless. Thomas liked the colored section better, though he'd never say so out loud. People sat on their porches in the morning, called out greetings, asked about his mama. Mrs. Johnson always had sweet tea waiting, would wave him over for a glass that she served in a mason jar, her hands wrinkled and gentle. Mr. Walker always wanted to talk about baseball, would argue passionately about whether Mays or Aaron was better, and Thomas would defend Mays even though he secretly agreed about Aaron, just for the pleasure of the argument. He was good at delivering papers, good at the rhythm of it. Bike, stop, throw, bike, stop, throw. The papers landed on porches with satisfying smacks. He liked being out early when the world was still half asleep, when the heat hadn't yet become unbearable, when Meridian felt like a town from a better story than the one it was actually living. The last delivery on his route was County Road 19, a stretch of dirt road that led out toward the pine forests. Old Man Henderson's place, a farmhouse set back from the road, surrounded by fields gone mostly to seed. Henderson had been old since Thomas could remember, bent and weathered like a tree that had survived too many storms. He took the paper every day, but Thomas suspected he couldn't read anymore, suspected the subscription was just loneliness with a mailing address. Thomas was pedaling toward Henderson's place when he saw the truck parked on the shoulder, hood up, a man bent over the engine. The truck was familiar, Sheriff Caldwell's personal vehicle, a blue Ford he drove when he wasn't in his official cruiser. Thomas had seen it around town 1,000 times, parked outside the diner, outside the church, outside the homes of people the sheriff visited to check on them, because that's what Warren Caldwell did. He checked on people. He kept the town safe. Thomas stopped his bike, because that's what you did in 1956 when you saw someone having car trouble. You stopped. You offered help, even if you were 14 and didn't know anything about engines. It was expected, the social contract of small-town life. Sheriff Caldwell looked up as Thomas approached, and his face did something strange, a flicker of expression too quick to name, there and gone like a shadow passing across water. Then he smiled, that familiar smile everyone in Meridian trusted, the smile that had gotten him elected sheriff 5 times running. "Morning, Tommy," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Truck's giving me trouble. Don't suppose you know anything about engines?" "No, sir," Thomas said, keeping his bike between them, suddenly and inexplicably uneasy. "I could ride to town and get Mr. Peterson from the garage." "That's real kind," Caldwell said, moving around the truck toward Thomas. "But I think I've about got it figured out. You're Robert Brennan's boy, aren't you? Eleanor's oldest?" "Yes, sir." "Good people. Your parents?" "Real good people." Caldwell was close now, close enough that Thomas could smell tobacco and coffee and something else, something that made the back of his neck prickle with animal awareness. "You're out early." "Paper route, sir. Got to finish before church." That's right. You're a good boy, Tommy. Your mama raised you right." Later, the investigators from 2024 would reconstruct what happened next through forensic evidence and DNA analysis and the cold logic of science. But in the moment, Thomas only knew that something was wrong, that the sheriff's smile didn't reach his eyes, that the hand reaching toward him was not a hand reaching to help. He tried to run. He got one foot on his bike pedal, started to push off, but Caldwell was faster than a 58-year-old man should have been, was on him before Thomas could get up to speed. They struggled. Thomas's fingernails raked across Caldwell's forearm, drawing blood, leaving DNA evidence that would wait 68 years to speak. Thomas screamed, but County Road 19 at 6:30 a.m. was empty, surrounded by pine forest that swallowed sound the way it swallowed everything else. The bicycle fell sideways in the dirt. Newspapers scattered like abandoned birds. One shoe came off in the struggle, would later be found in a drainage ditch, would become a piece of evidence that led nowhere because no one thought to collect DNA from the man who found it, the man who led the investigation, the man who was Sheriff Warren Caldwell. What happened next occurred in the truck, on dirt roads that wound through pine forests, in places where the sun barely reached through the canopy. Thomas Wade Brennan, 14 years old, paper boy, altar boy, clarinet player, son of Robert and Eleanor, brother of Caroline, fought for his life and lost. Caldwell dumped the body somewhere in the Neshoba County forest, one of those places where the earth is soft and the trees grow close and things stay hidden for decades. He burned Thomas's clothes. He kept the bicycle in his barn for a week, then abandoned it beside County Road 19, staging a scene that would lead the investigation away from the truth. He found the shoe later and planted it in the drainage ditch himself, creating a false trail, a narrative of abduction that led nowhere. Then he went home to his wife Martha, who was making breakfast. He showered. He put on his uniform. He became the man the town needed him to be, the sheriff, the protector, the one who would investigate Thomas Wade Brennan's disappearance with such thoroughness that no one would ever think to question him. The exhumation happened on a cold December morning in 2024 in the Meridian Memory Gardens, where Warren Caldwell had been laid to rest 26 years earlier. Claire Hollis stood at a distance, watching the backhoe tear into ground that had been settled and quiet, watching the earth give up what it had kept. The grave marker was substantial, granite, polished, inscribed with words of honor and service. Warren Mitchell Caldwell, 1909-1998, devoted servant, beloved husband, man of God. His widow Martha was buried beside him, had joined him in 2011, had died without ever knowing what her husband had done, or perhaps she had known. Perhaps she'd chosen not to know, which might be worse. The forensic team worked methodically, carefully, treating even the bones of a monster with the dignity that procedure demanded. Claire watched them work, thinking about how death equalizes everything, how the bones of saints and sinners look identical when stripped of the flesh that carried their choices. The team wore white protective suits that rustled in the December wind, moved with the careful precision of people handling evidence they knew would rewrite history. The grave yielded Caldwell's remains slowly, reluctantly, as if the earth itself was loath to give up what it had kept for 26 years. The coffin had held up well despite the years, the seal intact, protecting what lay inside from the dissolution that claims most things. When they opened it, Claire turned away, not from squeamishness. She'd seen too many bodies in too many states of decay for that, but from something else, some instinctive revulsion at looking at the face of this particular dead man, even reduced to skull and bone. They extracted DNA samples from Caldwell's remains, sent them to the state lab, ran them against the DNA found under Thomas Wade Brennan's fingernails. Claire didn't sleep for the 3 days it took for the results to come back, couldn't eat much, existed on coffee and the nervous energy of knowing that decades of work came down to this one test, this one scientific certainty. When the call came from the lab, she was standing at her apartment window, watching rain fall on the city, thinking about how water erases some things and reveals others. The lab technician's voice was professionally neutral, carefully devoid of the excitement or horror that such findings should warrant. The match was absolute, the science indisputable. The DNA under Thomas Wade Brennan's fingernails belonged to Warren Mitchell Caldwell. Probability of error, less than 1 in 7 billion. Statistical certainty. The dead don't lie, even when they've had 70 years to prepare their defense. Claire thanked the technician, hung up the phone, and sat down on her couch because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. This was the moment everything changed. The moment speculation became proof, suspicion became certainty, whispered possibility became documented fact. Warren Caldwell had killed Thomas Wade Brennan. The sheriff had murdered the boy. The guardian had destroyed the child. The wolf had worn the shepherd's clothes, and no one had noticed because no one had thought to look. She called Rachel Kim, the district attorney, who answered on the second ring and listened in silence as Claire laid out the DNA results. When Claire finished, there was a long pause, the kind of silence that comes when someone is processing information too large for immediate response. "Jesus Christ," Rachel said finally, and Claire heard in those 2 words everything she herself was feeling: vindication and horror, satisfaction and disgust, the relief of being right mixed with the sickness of what being right meant. "We need to hold a press conference," Claire said. "The family deserves to know first, but after that, we need to tell the public. This can't leak. This needs to be announced properly, with all the evidence laid out." "Agreed. Can you contact Caroline Brennan?" "I'll drive to Jackson tomorrow. This kind of news shouldn't come over the phone." The drive to Jackson took 3 hours through winter bare countryside, fields stripped and waiting for spring, trees skeletal against gray skies. Claire had called ahead, had asked Caroline if they could meet, had said it was important, but hadn't specified why. Caroline had agreed immediately, the way she always did when Claire called, with the desperate hope of someone who'd waited 68 years for answers and would wait 68 more if necessary. They met at Caroline's house, a modest ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that spoke of middle-class comfort and ordinary life. Caroline was 75, but looked older, worn down by decades of not knowing. Her father's serious eyes now nested in a landscape of wrinkles and age spots. She led Claire to the living room, offered coffee that Claire declined, sat down in an armchair that had probably held her for thousands of evenings of ordinary life that was always shadowed by extraordinary loss. "You've found something," Caroline said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Claire said. "The DNA results came back. We know who killed Thomas." Caroline's face did something complicated. Hope and fear and something else. Maybe the beginning of understanding that knowing would be its own kind of burden, that 68 years of not knowing might be easier than whatever came next. "Who?" "Warren Caldwell." The name hung in the air between them like something physical, like something that changed the molecular structure of the room just by being spoken. Caroline stared at Claire for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she did something Claire hadn't expected. She laughed. Not with humor, but with the kind of bitter recognition that comes when something you've suspected all along is finally confirmed, when the world reveals itself to be exactly as terrible as you feared. "Of course," Caroline said. "Of course it was him. It was always him, wasn't it? We just didn't want to see it." "What do you mean?" Caroline stood, walked to a bookshelf, pulled down a photo album that had the worn quality of something handled often. She opened it to a page near the middle, turned it toward Claire. The photograph showed a much younger Caroline, maybe 9 or 10, standing between her parents. Behind them, hand on Robert Brennan's shoulder in a gesture of support and solidarity, was Warren Caldwell in his sheriff's uniform, looking every inch the protective guardian, the man who cared about this family's tragedy. "He came to our house every week for years after Thomas disappeared," Caroline said, her voice hollow. "Every week. He'd sit with my parents, give them updates on the investigation, tell them he hadn't given up, that he was still looking. My mother loved him for that, for caring, for not forgetting. She'd make him coffee and thank him for his dedication. And all that time..." She couldn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Claire understood what Caroline was saying, that Caldwell had inserted himself into the family's grief, had fed off it, had enjoyed the performance of caring while knowing the entire time what had happened to Thomas, because he'd been the one who made it happen. "My father suspected," Caroline continued, closing the photo album with a sound like finality. "He never said it directly, but I could tell. The way he'd watch Caldwell sometimes, like he was trying to see behind the mask. The way he'd drink after Caldwell's visits, like he needed to wash something away. My mother thought the drinking was about Thomas, about the grief. But I think it was about the suspicion, about knowing something was wrong, but not being able to prove it, not even being able to say it out loud because who would believe that the sheriff, the man investigating your son's disappearance, was actually the one who killed him? Did your father ever say anything? Ever document his suspicions? No. Or if he did, he took it to his grave. He died in 1973, cirrhosis. They called it grief drinking. But now I wonder if it was guilt drinking. The guilt of suspecting but not speaking, of protecting a family's comfort over pursuing a truth that seemed impossible. Claire made notes, knowing that this would be important context for the press conference, for the investigation report, for the historical record. But more than that, she felt the weight of understanding how Caldwell had operated, not just as a killer, but as a psychological predator who'd found satisfaction in remaining close to his victims' families, in offering false comfort, in the sheer audacity of investigating a crime he'd committed. What happens now? Caroline asked. We announce it. We lay out all the evidence. We make sure the world knows what Warren Caldwell was, not what he pretended to be. Will that bring Thomas back? No. Will it make the past 68 years hurt any less? Probably not. Then why does it matter? It was the question Claire had asked herself many times, usually at 3 a.m. when the weight of her work felt unbearable. Because truth matters, she said finally. Because your brother's life mattered, and what happened to him mattered, and the man who killed him doesn't get to be remembered as a hero. That's why it matters. Because if we don't tell the truth, if we let comfortable lies stand, then we're accomplices to the deception. We become part of how evil hides. Caroline nodded slowly, tears finally coming. 68 years of held grief finding release. My mother died without knowing. That's what I can't forgive. That she spent 33 years loving the man who killed her son, thanking him for his dedication, praying for him at church. If there's a God, he has some explaining to do about that. Claire had no answer to that, had long ago stopped trying to reconcile the existence of evil with the idea of a benevolent universe. The world was what it was, sometimes just, more often not, always indifferent to human suffering. Claire had spent those months since the genealogical breakthrough reconstructing Warren Caldwell's life, looking for patterns, for other victims, for signs of what he'd hidden beneath his reputation. What she found was a man who'd been meticulous in his concealment, who'd learned from Thomas's case how to be more careful, how to choose victims who wouldn't be missed. There were others. 3 more, spanning decades. A drifter in 1961, passing through town, who vanished and was assumed to have simply moved on. A troubled teenager in 1969, runaway, whose disappearance was chalked up to the chaos of the era. A homeless man in 1983, who existed on society's margins and was mourned by no one. All men and boys, all vulnerable in different ways, all trusting the sheriff when he offered help. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Caldwell had used his position as sheriff to identify, isolate, and eliminate victims who wouldn't generate sustained investigation. Thomas Wade Brennan had been his first, his only mistake, because Thomas had fought back, had left DNA under his fingernails, had mattered enough to his community that his case was never officially closed, just forgotten. The old case files revealed the architecture of Caldwell's deception. He'd been the one to find evidence, to direct searches, to interview witnesses. He'd controlled the narrative completely, had used his authority to ensure that the investigation never turned toward him. When other detectives suggested possibilities that came too close to truth, Caldwell had redirected them, citing his experience, his knowledge of the town, his certainty that Thomas had been taken by a stranger passing through. The case file also revealed moments of astonishing cruelty, small notes in Caldwell's handwriting that took on new meaning in light of his guilt. After the memorial service in 1957, He'd written in his report, "Spoke with Eleanor Brennan. Assured her we're doing everything possible. She seems to be holding up well, considering." The coldness of that, the performance of sympathy for a mother whose son he'd murdered, whose grief he'd caused, and then documented like evidence. Claire interviewed everyone still alive who'd known Caldwell, and the portrait that emerged was consistent. A good man, a fair man, tough but compassionate, the kind of sheriff who knew everyone by name. He'd helped during floods and tornadoes. He'd driven elderly residents to doctor's appointments. He'd coached Little League, taught Sunday school, served on the town council. The cognitive dissonance was almost unbearable. How could the man who did those things also be the man who killed Thomas Wade Brennan? But that was the point, Claire understood. That was always the point. Monsters don't look like monsters. They look like the people we trust, the ones we give authority to, the ones we believe would never hurt us. Evil doesn't announce itself with fangs and claws. It wears a badge and smiles and asks if you need help, and by the time you realize your mistake, it's too late. She found Martha Caldwell's diary in the attic of the house where Warren's daughter now lived. The daughter, Sharon, was 73, her father's death still raw even after 26 years, the revelation of his crimes an earthquake that had shattered her entire understanding of her life. She'd given Claire access to everything, desperate to understand, desperate to find evidence that maybe it wasn't true, even as she knew it was. The diary covered 60 years of marriage, Martha's neat handwriting filling page after page with the mundane details of life, shopping lists, prayer requests, observations about weather and grandchildren and church socials. Reading it was like watching someone live an entire life beside a secret so large it blocked out the sun, yet never quite acknowledging the shadow. But there were hints, small moments where Martha's certainty wavered. June 1956. Warren has been distant since that poor Brennan boy went missing. He takes these things so personally, carries the weight of it. October 1961. Warren says the drifter probably just moved on, but I wonder how he can be so sure. March 1969. Another runaway. Warren says they usually don't come back. How does he know these things? The question that haunted Claire was whether Martha had known, whether on some level she'd understood what her husband was, had chosen loyalty over truth, had decided that the cost of knowing was too high, or whether she'd genuinely lived 60 years beside a killer and never suspected, which raised its own disturbing questions about how well we know anyone, even the person we sleep beside. Claire conducted interviews that felt like archaeology, excavating truth from layers of time and denial. She spoke with Warren's former deputies, now elderly men who'd worshipped him, who'd learned policing from him, who had to confront the possibility that everything they'd learned was corrupted at its source. She spoke with Robert and Eleanor Brennan's few remaining relatives, cousins, nephews, people who'd grown up in the long shadow of Thomas's disappearance. She spoke with Caroline Brennan's daughter, Thomas's niece, who'd never met her uncle, but had grown up with his absence as a presence in every family gathering, every holiday, every moment when someone said, "I wish Thomas was here to see this." The forensic evidence mounted like stones, each piece adding weight to what was already undeniable. The DNA match, the pattern of victims, the timeline of Caldwell's movements on June 23, 1956, reconstructed from documents he'd filed himself, showing gaps and inconsistencies that no one had questioned because he was the sheriff, and the sheriff was above suspicion. The district attorney was a woman named Rachel Kim, 46, originally from California, who'd moved to Mississippi to work in civil rights law and stayed because she believed in redemption, in the possibility of justice, even in places with long histories of injustice. She reviewed Claire's evidence in silence, sitting in her office as winter rain fell outside, reading report after report, document after document. When she finished, she looked at Claire with an expression somewhere between admiration and horror. "We can't prosecute a dead man," she said finally. "I know. But we can tell the truth." Rachel tapped the stack of evidence. "We can give the family answers. We can correct the record. We can make sure Warren Caldwell doesn't go down in history as a hero. That's all I'm asking." The press conference happened on a Tuesday in January 2025 in the Meridian City Hall, where Warren Caldwell had once received awards and accolades. Claire stood at the podium with Rachel Kim beside her, looking out at reporters and cameras, and, in the front row, Caroline Brennan Walker, 75 years old now, her father's serious eyes in her weathered face, her hands clutching a photograph of her brother. Claire spoke for 20 minutes, laying out the evidence with clinical precision, letting the facts build the narrative. No emotion, no editorializing, just science and investigation, and the slow revelation of truth. Warren Caldwell had killed Thomas Wade Brennan on June 23, 1956. He had killed at least 3 other victims over the following decades. He had used his position as sheriff to conceal his crimes and control the investigation. The DNA evidence was incontrovertible. The case was solved. The silence afterward was absolute. The kind of silence that comes when an entire room is processing something too large to immediately comprehend. Then the questions started. The demands for explanation. The hunger for details that would make sense of the senseless. Rachel Kim fielded most of the questions, her voice calm and authoritative. Yes, they were certain. Yes, the DNA evidence was solid. No, they couldn't prosecute Caldwell posthumously, but they could ensure his reputation reflected reality. Yes, they were reviewing all cold cases from his tenure as sheriff. Yes, they believed there might be additional victims. When the questions finally exhausted themselves, a reporter from the Meridian Star asked the question Claire had been waiting for. "Does this change anything? Caldwell's been dead 26 years. The victims are all dead. What's the point of dragging this up now?" Caroline Brennan Walker stood before anyone could answer. She was small, white-haired, elegant in her grief, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 68 years of not knowing. "My brother was 14 years old," she said. "He left for his paper route on a Sunday morning and never came home. My mother died in 1989 without knowing what happened to him. My father drank himself to death in 1973 because he couldn't stand the not knowing. I've lived my entire life with a hole where Thomas should have been, and now, finally, I know why. So you ask, what's the point? The point is truth. The point is that Thomas Wade Brennan mattered, and what happened to him mattered, and the man who killed him doesn't get to be remembered as a hero. That's the point." The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. The silence of people confronting their own complicity in collective forgetting, in the conspiracy of looking away. The announcement of Warren Caldwell's guilt hit Meridian like a bomb going off underground, the kind that doesn't make noise at first, but sends cracks spiderwebbing through everything. Within days, the town had divided into camps, those who believed the evidence and those who wouldn't, refused to let their understanding of the world crack open to accommodate this new and terrible truth. A petition circulated demanding that Caldwell's name be removed from the Warren M. Caldwell Community Center, the building that had been named in his honor in 1995, 3 years before his death. The petition gathered 2,947 signatures. A counterpetition defending Caldwell's legacy, claiming the DNA evidence was somehow contaminated or misinterpreted, gathered 3,104 signatures. The mathematics of denial, Claire thought, watching the numbers climb. How the human need for certainty outweighs the human capacity for truth. The community center debate went to the city council in February 2025, a meeting that stretched past midnight, citizens lining up to speak for or against, to defend or condemn the man they thought they'd known. Claire attended but didn't speak, just sat in the back row and watched democracy struggle with horror. An elderly woman, 91, who'd been Martha Caldwell's closest friend, spoke about Warren's kindness, about the time he'd helped her change a tire in the rain, about the money he'd quietly given to families in need. "I knew him for 50 years, she said, voice shaking. "You can't fake goodness for 50 years. You just can't." But you could, Claire knew. You could fake anything if you were patient enough, careful enough, if you understood that the mask you wore didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be what people wanted to see. Thomas's niece spoke, reading a statement her mother Caroline had written, but was too exhausted to deliver herself. "My grandmother used to say she felt Warren Caldwell's presence at family gatherings, his support during the dark times after Thomas disappeared. She found comfort in his regular visits, his updates on the investigation, his promise that they'd never stop looking. Now we understand what those visits really were. The killer returning to the scene of his crime, feeding off the grief he'd caused, enjoying the performance of sympathy. That's what you're defending when you defend his legacy. That cruelty, that deception, that evil." The vote was 5-4 to remove Caldwell's name from the building. The building is now called the Meridian Community Center. The sign changed on a cold Tuesday morning, while protesters from both sides lined the street, holding signs, shouting across the divide that had opened in their town like a chasm. Claire, meanwhile, continued investigating the other victims, the ones whose cases had been filed away, forgotten, written off as unsolved because unsolvable. The drifter from 1961, James Earl Washington, she learned, a Korean War veteran with PTSD who'd been traveling the country trying to find peace in motion. The runaway from 1969, Christopher Mills, 16, gay in an era and place where that meant danger, who'd fled his home and ended up in Meridian by terrible chance. The homeless man from 1983, Marcus Brown, 43, schizophrenic, who'd lost everything and ended up on streets that treated him as invisible. Each victim had a story, had people who'd mourned them or should have, had lives that mattered, even if society had decided they didn't. Claire built files for each one, reconstructed their last days, established what evidence still existed. The DNA was impossible to match now. No bodies had ever been found, no evidence preserved. But the pattern was clear, the method consistent, and Caldwell's own case notes sometimes revealed glimpses of his guilt if you knew how to read them. She found Christopher Mills's mother still alive, 87, living in a nursing home in Jackson. The woman wept when Claire told her what had happened to her son. Wept not just from grief, but from relief at finally knowing. "I always thought he hated me," she said. "I thought he ran away and never came back because I wasn't a good enough mother. I thought I failed him. And all this time." Claire sat with her for 2 hours, holding her hand, letting her talk about Christopher, about the boy he'd been before the world told him what he was wrong, about the letters she'd written to missing persons organizations for decades, about the hope that had gradually calcified into guilt. Sometimes justice wasn't about prosecution or punishment. Sometimes it was just about giving someone permission to stop blaming themselves. The investigation also revealed the systems that had enabled Caldwell. the total control sheriffs had in small counties in that era, the lack of oversight, the absence of forensic standards, the tendency to defer to authority. The way victims from marginalized communities, drifters, runaways, homeless people, were treated as disposable, their disappearances noted but not mourned, investigated but not solved. Caldwell hadn't just been a killer. He'd been a killer who understood exactly which victims society was prepared to forget. Claire gave interviews to newspapers and true crime podcasts, not because she wanted attention, but because she believed in the power of documentation, in the necessity of ensuring these victims were remembered. Each interview was the same questions in different forms. How did he get away with it so long? How did no one suspect? How could someone seem so good and be so evil? The answers were complicated and simple both. He got away with it because he had power and used it carefully. No one suspected because he looked like what they wanted to believe good looked like. He seemed good while being evil because humans are capable of extraordinary compartmentalization, of living double lives so completely that even they might believe the mask is real. But there was something else, too. Something darker that Claire tried to articulate in her interviews but could never quite capture. Warren Caldwell had enjoyed it. Not just the killing, though evidence suggested he'd found satisfaction in that too, but the performance afterward, the investigation he controlled, the comfort he offered grieving families, the way the town looked at him with trust and gratitude. He'd enjoyed being the hero in a tragedy he'd created, had felt powerful watching people look to him for answers he already had. That was the horror that kept Claire awake at night. Not that evil could wear a mask, but that sometimes the mask itself was part of the pleasure. That some killers found satisfaction not just in the act of killing, but in the performance of investigating, in the power of standing between the truth and those desperate to know it. The graves were in the Neshoba County Forest, exactly where Caldwell's case notes had hinted, if you knew how to read between the lines. He'd written about search areas in Thomas's case, about places they'd checked and ruled out. And looking back, Claire could see how he'd directed searchers away from specific locations, how he'd marked certain areas as already cleared when they hadn't been. It took 3 months of searching, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, and the grim science of finding the long-buried dead. They found Thomas first, 20 feet down in a ravine that had gradually filled with soil and leaves over decades. The forensic anthropologist who examined the remains was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd worked on mass graves in Bosnia and Rwanda, and who brought to her work a fierce gentleness, a recognition that bones were people first. Thomas Wade Brennan's skeleton told the story of his last moments: fractures on his skull, defensive wounds on his arms, compression damage to his throat. He'd fought hard, this 14-year-old boy, had tried to survive, had lost because he was small, and Caldwell was strong, and the universe doesn't care about justice, only physics. They found the others over the following weeks, each discovery marked with flags and GPS coordinates and the procedural dignity of investigation. James Earl Washington, Christopher Mills, Marcus Brown. Each burial site was photographed, documented, excavated with archaeological precision. Each set of remains was treated with the respect they'd been denied in death. Claire attended each exhumation, standing at a distance, bearing witness because someone needed to, because these victims had been invisible in life, and she refused to let them be invisible in death. Sometimes victims' family members came. Christopher Mills's elderly mother in a wheelchair, her daughter pushing her through the forest to the site where her son had been buried for 41 years. They stood in silence while the forensic team worked, and Claire thought about how grief doesn't fade. It just changes shape, becomes something you carry differently. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath during those excavations, pine trees whispering in wind that smelled like earth and rain. This was sacred ground now, not in any religious sense, but in the weight of what had happened here, what had been hidden and was now revealed. Memorials would be erected here eventually, markers to ensure that Thomas and James and Christopher and Marcus would be remembered in the place where they'd been forgotten. DNA confirmed what Claire had already known. All 4 victims showed signs of having been in contact with Warren Caldwell's genetic material. The science was absolute, the evidence unimpeachable. These murders, and possibly others that would never be discovered, were his responsibility, his legacy, his truth. The funeral for Thomas Wade Brennan happened on a May morning in 2025, 69 years after he'd disappeared. Caroline Brennan Walker had planned it with the same meticulous care her mother Eleanor would have used, choosing hymns and flowers and words that would have meaning to a boy they'd never gotten to see grow up. The church was First Methodist, the same church where Thomas had been an altar boy, where Warren Caldwell had given his eulogy at the memorial service in 1957, where Caldwell himself had been eulogized in 1998. The church was full. Some attendees had known Thomas, elderly now, faces weathered by 7 decades of life. Others were young, drawn by the story, by the tragedy, by the human need to bear witness to suffering. Claire sat in the back, as she always did, watching but not participating, because this wasn't her grief to claim. Caroline spoke at the funeral, standing at the pulpit with Thomas's school photo beside her, the same photo that had been in the case file, that Claire had studied so many times she saw it when she closed her eyes. Caroline talked about her brother, about the boy he'd been, serious, funny, kind, a protector who'd walked her to school and checked her homework, and once spent all his paper route money on a birthday present for their mother. She talked about the hole his disappearance had left, about how their family had tried to grow around his absence but never quite managed, how grief had shaped them all into different people than they might have been. "I want to thank Detective Hollis," Caroline said, looking directly at Claire, "for refusing to let my brother be forgotten, for doing what Warren Caldwell never did, seeking truth, regardless of where it led. Thomas deserved justice. We all deserve truth. And now, finally, we have both." The burial was in Meridian Memory Gardens, in a plot beside his parents. Robert and Eleanor reunited with their son after 69 years of separation. The gravestone was simple granite, inscribed with his name, his dates, and one line: "Forever 14, finally home." Claire stood at the graveside as the casket was lowered, watching dirt fall on wood, thinking about all the ways a life can end, and all the ways truth can be buried, and all the impossible resilience of people who keep searching long after searching seems pointless. Caroline threw a handful of dirt into the grave, then a clarinet reed. Thomas had never gotten his own instrument, had died with $37 in a coffee can, $28 short of his dream. The reed fell onto the casket like a promise kept too late, which was better than never kept at all. The question everyone wanted answered was the one that had no answer. Why? Why had Warren Caldwell killed Thomas Wade Brennan? Why had he continued killing for decades? What makes someone look at a 14-year-old boy on a bicycle and see not a person, but an opportunity? Claire had spent months analyzing Caldwell's life, looking for trauma or trigger or explanation. His childhood had been ordinary. Born in 1909 to farmers in rural Mississippi, raised during the Depression, served in World War II, came home and became a deputy sheriff, married Martha in 1938, had 2 children, who seemed normal and well-adjusted. There was no obvious trigger, no clear moment when something broke inside him and he became capable of murder. The criminal psychologist Claire consulted, Dr. Marcus Webb, suggested that Caldwell might have been what's called an organizational killer, methodical, controlled, able to compartmentalize his life completely. These individuals often hold positions of trust, Webb explained during their consultation in his office in Jackson, rain falling outside, case files spread between them. They understand social expectations and can perform normalcy perfectly. The killing isn't about rage or loss of control. It's about power, about the satisfaction of having control over life and death while maintaining a public facade of respectability. But explanations felt inadequate to the weight of what Caldwell had done. Psychology could describe the mechanism, but it couldn't touch the mystery of human evil, the question of how someone becomes capable of looking at another person and choosing to end them, then going home to dinner with their wife. Claire had read Caldwell's own words extensively, his case reports, his letters to the editor of the Meridian Star about crime and punishment, his speeches at community events. He'd written eloquently about justice, about protecting the innocent, about the duty law enforcement had to serve their communities. Reading those words now, knowing what she knew, was like watching someone speak a foreign language that only sounded like English. There was one letter in particular that haunted her, written to the paper in 1973 after he retired. I've spent 32 years in law enforcement, and what I've learned is that evil is real. Not metaphorical evil, not sociological evil, but genuine human evil. The capacity some people have to harm others without remorse, without conscience. The job of law enforcement is to protect the innocent from these predators, to stand between the darkness and the light. I like to think I've done that. I like to think I've made a difference. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The killer writing about protecting the innocent from killers, the predator warning about predators, the darkness describing itself as light. And the most disturbing part was that he might have actually believed it, might have constructed a narrative where his public service somehow balanced his private crimes, where being a good sheriff 90% of the time excused being a murderer. The other 10%, or perhaps he'd believed nothing, had simply enjoyed the performance, had found satisfaction in the sheer audacity of it, killing people and then investigating their deaths, offering comfort to families whose pain he'd caused, accepting awards for service to a community he'd victimized. Perhaps the words were just another mask, and behind all the masks was something that couldn't be understood in human terms. Claire interviewed serial killer experts, read books about psychopathy and sociopathy, and the various ways that science tried to categorize the uncategorizable. She learned about the BTK killer, who'd been a church leader while murdering families, about John Wayne Gacy, who'd dressed as a clown at children's parties while bodies rotted in his crawl space, about all the killers who'd hidden in plain sight, protected by the cognitive dissonance that makes it impossible for people to believe that the person who helps them jumpstart their car could also be someone who kills. But Warren Caldwell was different in one crucial way. He'd had total institutional power. He hadn't just hidden his crimes, he'd investigated them, controlled the narrative, directed the search away from himself. He'd turned law enforcement itself into a tool for concealing murder. That required not just the capacity for violence, but a particular kind of intelligence, patience, and understanding of human psychology. The hardest interviews were with Caldwell's family, his daughter Sharon, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. They were victims too, in a different way. People whose entire understanding of their family history had been destroyed by the revelation of their patriarch's crimes. Sharon met with Claire several times, desperate to understand, desperate to find some way to reconcile the grandfather who'd taught her to fish with the monster who'd killed children. "He was good to us," Sharon said during one of these meetings, sitting in Claire's office, photographs of Caldwell spread across the desk between them. "He was patient and kind and funny. He never raised his voice. He taught me to change a tire, to balance a checkbook, to stand up for myself. Those memories are real. I know they're real. But how can they be real when this is also real?" Claire had no answer that would satisfy, because there was no answer. Humans contain multitudes, including the capacity to be genuinely kind to some people while murdering others. The kindness wasn't fake just because the killing was real. Both were true simultaneously, and the human mind struggles with that kind of contradiction. "My grandmother loved him," Sharon continued. 60 years of marriage, and she loved him until the day she died. Was she wrong? Was her love meaningless because she didn't know what he was? "I think," Claire said carefully, "that your grandmother loved the man she knew. That man was real to her. The fact that he was also someone else, someone she never saw, that doesn't make her love invalid. It makes her a victim of his deception." "But that's not enough," Sharon said. "That's not enough to explain how I could have Sunday dinners with him every week for 40 years and never suspect, never feel anything wrong, never see any sign of what he was capable of. What does that say about me? About my judgment? About how little we actually know the people we love?" Those were the questions that would haunt everyone who'd known Warren Caldwell, would keep them awake at night, would reshape their understanding of memory and trust and the fundamental reliability of their own perceptions. How do you trust your judgment ever again when you were so completely deceived? How do you love anyone when love didn't protect you from loving a monster? Claire Hollis requested reassignment to robbery homicide 6 months after Thomas Wade Brennan was finally laid to rest. The cold case unit had become too heavy, too full of ghosts, too much weight pressing on her chest every time she walked into the archives. Her lieutenant understood, or claimed to, offered the transfer without question, without judgment. But the truth was more complicated. Claire had spent 3 years on the Brennan case, had lived with Thomas and Warren and Caroline and all the victims and all the questions that would never have satisfactory answers. She'd done what she set out to do, solved the case, brought truth to light, gave the family closure or something close to it. But in solving the case, she'd opened something inside herself that couldn't be closed again, a awareness of how much evil could hide, how thoroughly it could disguise itself, how completely you could be deceived by someone you trusted. She thought about Warren Caldwell sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet and she was alone with her thoughts. Tried to understand him, tried to get inside his head, tried to find some explanation that would make it make sense. But evil doesn't make sense. That's the point. It exists outside the frameworks we use to organize the world, outside the narratives we tell ourselves about cause and effect, motivation and consequence. Evil just is, and sometimes the only response is to stand against it, to refuse to look away, to insist on truth even when truth is uncomfortable. The Brennan case had changed Meridian, had forced the town to confront uncomfortable questions about its own history, its own willingness to look away, its own investment in maintaining comfortable narratives even when those narratives concealed terrible truths. Some people in Meridian still defended Caldwell, still insisted that the DNA evidence was somehow wrong, that a good man was being posthumously slandered. But most had accepted it, had begun the hard work of incorporating this new reality into their understanding of their town's history. The community center bearing Caldwell's name was renamed. His plaque at the sheriff's office was removed. The scholarship fund established in his honor was dissolved. The remaining money donated to organizations supporting victims of violent crime. These were symbolic gestures, inadequate to the weight of what he'd done. But symbols matter. They're how communities signal what they value, what they reject, who they choose to honor, and who they choose to condemn. Thomas Wade Brennan's grave became a place of pilgrimage for some, people who'd followed the case and wanted to pay respects to a boy they'd never known, but whose story had touched them. Caroline visited weekly, brought fresh flowers, sat beside her brother's headstone, and told him about her life, about the children and grandchildren he'd never met, about the world that had changed so much since 1956. Claire visited once, a month after the funeral, drove to Meridian on a Saturday, and stood at Thomas's grave in morning light that made the granite headstone shine. She'd brought nothing, no flowers, no offerings, just herself and the weight of what she'd learned. She stood for a long time in silence, thinking about the boy Thomas had been, about the life stolen from him, about the 70 years between his death and his justice. "I'm sorry it took so long," she said finally, speaking to granite and grass and the air that carried her words away. "I'm sorry you were forgotten. I'm sorry the person who should have protected you was the one who killed you. I'm sorry for all of it." The grave didn't answer, of course. The dead don't speak, except through the evidence they leave behind, the DNA under their fingernails, the truth that waits for someone to finally look close enough to see it. Thomas Wade Brennan had been silent for 69 years, but in the end, his silence spoke louder than any words, had reached across decades to condemn his killer and restore his memory. Claire drove back to Meridian that afternoon, watching the Mississippi landscape roll past, pine forests and fields and small towns that looked peaceful and ordinary and hid God knows what secrets. She thought about all the cold cases still unsolved, all the victims still unnamed, all the killers who'd gotten away with it because they were careful or lucky or both. She thought about the weight of being one of the people who tries to balance the scales, who stands between the past's forgotten victims and the present's comfortable ignorance. The work was impossible in the end. There were too many victims, too few investigators, too much time between crime and consequence. Most cold cases would stay cold. Most killers would never be caught. Most families would never know what happened to their loved ones. That was just reality, the mathematics of tragedy. But sometimes, occasionally, rarely, someone looked at the right file at the right time, someone asked the right question, someone refused to accept comfortable lies, and the truth came out. Thomas Wade Brennan had been one of those rare cases, had been lucky in his unluckiness, had left behind just enough evidence that 68 years later, someone could finally read it and understand. That was what Claire held on to, not the weight of the unsolved, but the possibility of the solved. Not the darkness of how much evil existed, but the light of how sometimes, against odds, truth emerged anyway. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. And in a world where Warren Caldwell could be sheriff and killer simultaneously, where evil could wear a badge and a smile and speak eloquently about justice, sometimes something was all you had. The story doesn't end with justice, because stories about murder never really end. They just stop being told, fade into the background noise of history, become footnotes in a town's past that people mention sometimes and mostly forget. Thomas Wade Brennan is buried beside his parents now, And every June 23rd, a memorial service is held at First Methodist Church, smaller each year as people forget or die or move away, but held nonetheless. Caroline Brennan Walker attends when her health allows, joined by her children and grandchildren who never knew Thomas, but carry his memory as inheritance. Warren Caldwell's grave remains in Meridian Memory Gardens, unmarked now, the granite headstone removed by family who couldn't bear to see his name engraved with honor. The earth has settled over his bones, and grass has grown, and nothing marks the spot except GPS coordinates in a county database. Some graves deserve flowers and remembrance. Others deserve only the weight of earth and the silence of forgetting. The case file sits in the Meridian Police Department archives, marked solved in red letters, dated 2024-2025, a gap of 68 years between the crime and its conclusion. Other investigators will study it sometimes, learning from Claire's methodology, understanding how genealogical DNA can reach back through decades to identify killers who thought they'd gotten away with it. The techniques will improve, the science will advance, and more cold cases will be solved because Thomas Wade Brennan's fingernails scratched DNA from his killer's arm, and someone finally knew how to read what that evidence said. Claire Hollis moved on to other cases, other victims, other investigations that would keep her awake at night and make her question how much she could carry and when the weight would finally break her. She solved some cases and failed at others because that's how detective work goes. Success and failure measured in closed files and families who finally knew the truth and families who never would. But sometimes, late at night when insomnia had her by the throat, she thought about Thomas, about the boy on the bicycle, about the paper route, about the moment when he stopped to help someone he trusted and learned too late that trust was just another word for vulnerability. She thought about how he'd fought, how he'd scratched at his killer's arm, how in his last moments he'd left evidence that would eventually speak for him, would eventually reach across 7 decades to say his name again. That's what haunted her most, not the evil, but the resistance to evil. Not Warren Caldwell's capacity for violence, but Thomas Wade Brennan's capacity for hope. He'd been 14 years old, riding his bicycle through summer heat, delivering newspapers and saving money for a clarinet, believing the world was basically safe and people were basically good, and helping someone with car trouble was just what decent people did. And when that trust was betrayed, when the world revealed itself as dangerous and people as capable of unfathomable cruelty, he'd fought anyway, had resisted anyway, had left behind evidence anyway, as if even in death he'd believed that truth mattered, that justice was possible, that someone would eventually care enough to look. He'd been right to believe, though it took 68 years to prove it. And maybe that's the only way to survive in a world where Warren Caldwells exist, where evil can wear any face and hide behind any reputation. To believe anyway, to resist anyway, to keep fighting even when fighting seems futile, to trust that eventually, possibly, someone will care enough to remember, to investigate, to refuse to accept comfortable lies and demand uncomfortable truth. The sun sets over Meridian, Mississippi, and rises again, and people go about their lives, and the past recedes into history, and stories are forgotten and sometimes remembered, and justice happens rarely, but sometimes, and that's all we have. The possibility of truth, the resistance of victims who refuse to stay silent even in death, the persistence of investigators who refuse to let the forgotten stay buried. Thomas Wade Brennan was 14 years old when he died in summer heat in 1956, and he is 14 years old forever now, frozen at that moment on County Road 19, on his bicycle, believing in the goodness of people who offer help, The world failed him then. But 68 years later, finally, the world remembered his name, sought truth about his death, and held accountable, if only in posthumous judgment, the man who killed him. It's not enough. It's never enough. The dead stay dead, and time doesn't flow backward, and justice can't undo what was done. But it's something. In a world that moves too fast toward forgetting, remembering is an act of resistance. In a world that prefers comfortable lies, truth-telling is an act of courage. In a world where evil hides in plain sight, seeing clearly is an act of justice. Thomas Wade Brennan mattered. His life mattered. His death mattered. His memory matters still. And perhaps that's all any of us can hope for. That when we're gone, someone will care enough to remember, to investigate, to refuse to let our stories disappear into silence. The case is closed. The file is archived. The truth is told. And somewhere in Meridian Memory Gardens, beneath granite that reads, Forever 14, finally home, a boy who loved the clarinet and saved his paper route money and believed in helping people rests at last beside his parents. His long absence ended, his story remembered, his justice delayed but delivered, his silence finally heard.